Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the NT podcast. I'm Nemanja Jurišić. In today's episode, we are diving into some deep questions in philosophy of religion and metaphysics, especially surrounding the causal principle, the Kalam Cosmological Argument, and the newer developments, sometimes called the New Kalam. Our guest today is Joe Schmid, a philosophy PhD candidate at Princeton University and the creator and the host of the widely respected YouTube channel Majesty of Reason. Joe, welcome.
Thanks so much. I'm very excited for today.
Thank you very much for joining us today. And Joe, you have probably made more videos on the internet about the Kalam argument than anyone else I know. So is it true? So I think
That
this
that
is
may
the
be true. I mean, maybe other than William Lane Craig, it is probably true that I have made more videos than anyone else on the Kalam. And I mean, certainly on the critical side, I think I take that number one spot in the world, I'm guessing. So yeah, maybe that's a term. I should go around wearing a shirt that just says like has most videos on the Kalam, Or maybe if one of my patrons wants to give me some money to do that, I'd be welcome. I'd welcome all that money. No, I'm kidding.
Are you sure that you didn't make more videos on Kalam than Craig? I'm not so sure.
Who knows? Who knows?
All right. So, can you, for the beginning, tell us something about your background, your biography, anything about you for people that maybe don't know you? So that's the first thing. And also, how you first encountered this argument? What were the reaction to it in academia, both then and now? And in what direction is the discussion moving today? Is this considered as a proof for God, debunked argument, or something in between? So the floor is yours.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, thanks again for the very kind introduction. For people who don't know, I do both popular and scholarly work in philosophy. So on the popular level, as you said, Majesty of Reason, objectively the best channel that has ever existed, of course. So people need to immediately go there, subscribe, turn on all the notifications. No. But yeah, I make lecture videos of my own, and I also host discussions with other philosophers on various topics, mostly philosophy of religion, but I'm also delving into philosophy of mind and various other topics as well. Um, and then I also just do scholarly work in philosophy. So I publish in philosophy of religion, metaphysics, and hopefully, starting soon, philosophy of mind as well. So people can go to josephschmid.com if they want to read my papers. They can go on to Phil Papers. All of my papers should be freely available to read on that website, so they can check that out. And I've done a lot of work on the New Kalam, especially, um, and I've also uh, done some work more recently in an analytic philosophy paper in the journal Analytic Philosophy with Troy Dana, who was a previous guest of yours, on the Old Kalam as well, or certain aspects of the Old Kalam as we will define it. Okay, so that's some of my relevant background. In terms of when I first encountered the Kalam cosmological argument, yeah, I think it was in high school when I was really starting to basically get philosophy pilled. I just started getting addicted to philosophy, and I started watching all these debates in philosophy of religion. Philosophy of religion was my first and my continued love in philosophy. And I just came across the work of William Lane Craig, various others, and I just watched debates in which the Kalam featured. And wow, it was just very interesting, captivated me. Just thinking about cosmic origins, ultimate origins. Like it just seemed like such a fundamental question. Like, where did all this stuff come from? That seems pretty important. So like why not study this further? So it activated me. I was interested in it. And then in terms of how the academy sort of sees this argument, I mean it's mostly talked about within philosophy of religion. There's a little bit of discussion about the argument in philosophy of physics in some areas, but it's mainly in philosophy of religion. And also certain peripheral aspects of Kalam debates are discussed in metaphysics. So, debates about infinity, the metaphysics of the infinitary paradox, certain recombination or Patrick principles that show up in the defense of certain premises in the New Kalam. So like all that stuff is definitely taken, very seriously in the academy more generally. In philosophy of religion, as far as I can tell, there just still is live, active, ongoing debate about whether the Kalam succeeds. My sense is that more people are moving towards the new Kalam than the old Kalam in the contemporary literature. We'll define what those are momentarily, or at least soon enough. But but there just is disagreement. So I think it'd be unfair to say one way or another that it's been debunked or that it's been proven or anything like that. That would not accurately reflect the state of the relevant literature. So Hope that answers your question, and maybe we can start delving into the particular issues.
Yes, I think that's fair comment. So thank you so much. And a quick question before we start: Ronaldo or Messi? Because you are a big fan of Arsenal. So can you
Yes,
give
I'm a
us
massive
opinion on
Arsenal
that?
fan. Yeah, listen, I mean, I think these are the two best football players who have ever played the game. Okay, so that's the first thing to say, and that I think we should enjoy them both, to be honest. Like, I'm not here to hate on anyone. I mean, you asked me a question, and I do have an opinion on it. I mean, I'm a Messi guy, so sorry to all the Ronaldo people, but yeah, Messi I think is the GOAT. So
Okay, I'm
no further
Messi fan,
defense.
but I'm Ronaldo fan. But yeah, I admit that Messi is objectively better. I think. Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah, again, I got nothing against Ronaldo. Like, amazing player. Again, both of those guys are the goats. But if I had to pick one, it'd be Messi.
yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. Let's go. So what do you think about the three arguments that Craig offers in the support of causal principle? You can share screen, of course. Yeah. So his first is it is not possible for something to come from nothing.
Yeah. So as you said, Craig develops three different lines of support in favor of his causal principle in the Kalam cosmological argument. So here we're talking about the Old Kalam. Um, Now we're going to distinguish between the Old Kalam and the New Kalam later, but maybe here it's just might be helpful to say something about that distinction. Um, Basically, the New Kalam crucially centers on causal finitism. So, and again, this is just like terminology that me and a few others have kind of latched onto. I think Rob Koons may have introduced it, but like the most familiar variant of the Kalam cosmological argument, the one championed by William Lane Craig, among others, is the Old Kalam, what we were calling the Old Kalam. So it's first premise: whatever begins to exist has a cause. That's the causal principle. The second premise is the empirical premise that the universe began to exist. From those, it follows that the universe has a cause for its existence. And then that's the first stage of reasoning in the Old Kalam. And then there's a second stage of reasoning where you try to identify that first cause of the universe with God, or at least to try to argue that it has various divine or religiously significant attributes of some sort. Okay. Um, the term old is not meant to be derogatory. It just, the fact is just that it originated much earlier than the other variant. And William Lane Craig is to be credited with, like basically reinvigorating debates about this sort of argument back in I think even the 70s, if I recall correctly. This was based on his dissertation. Um, the other variant, the New Kalam, is based on causal finitism and like some of these newer paradoxes involved with causal finitism, and that has been championed, by Alexander Pruss, Rob Koons, among others. I think Jacobus Erasmus and some others. We'll get to the New Kalam later, but we'll focus here on the Old Kalam. So the question that you asked me was, what about Craig's three arguments, and in particular his first argument for that causal principle, according to which whatever begins to exist has a cause? So yeah, I mean, the first argument that he gives is basically saying, I understand it as a kind of appeal to intuition, right? So he's basically saying like, just to suggest that things could just pop into being uncaused out of nothing is like just deeply intuitively implausible. Like it seems absurd, according to Craig. And he says it's to quit, to sort of suggest that could happen is to quit doing serious metaphysics and to resort to magic. And he says that nobody sincerely believes that things, say a horse or an Eskimo village, can just pop into being without a cause. Um, Now that's
Actually,
not
it's
clear.
worse than magic, right?
Right, according to him, it's worse than magic because in magic you actually have the magician, as he says. According to Craig again. Now again, he says like nobody seriously believes this. That's surely false. I mean, some people sincerely believe this. I mean, Hume seemed to have sincerely thought that this could happen, but um, you know, uh, he's being rhetorical, and that's okay. He can have his rhetorical flourishes. He's a very good rhetorician. I will give him that. Okay, so what do I say about this first argument from intuition? We could call it. Well, like hands up, I do share the intuition that coming into existence uncaused seems implausible. Okay, so I share that intuition. But I think the key question here is how dialectically effective is that appeal to intuition? That is like, how effective is it in an argumentative context where we're trying to convince others to accept our ultimate conclusion, right? I mean, it's one thing to like, personally have an intuition, but it's another thing to actually like give other people reason to accept the relevant premise. And so whether or not this argument from intuition gives other people a reason to accept the causal principle is going to depend on several things. So first, I think it'll just depend on whether we accept that intuitions justify us in believing their content. So if I intuit that P, does that justify me in believing that P, at least in the absence of defeaters? So defeaters are just other considerations that outweigh the support that the intuition would provide, or that would undercut or remove the support that the intuition provides for believing its content. So like, do intuitions justify one in believing their contents, at least defeasibly, in the absence of those sorts of defeaters? That view is called phenomenal conservatism, that they do in fact justify you in the absence of defeaters. I am, a card-carrying phenomenal conservative. I like that view, but it is very controversial in epistemology. So, I mean, for starters, I think this is going to rely on something like, at the very least, phenomenal conservatism, which is, we should at least note that it's controversial and there are various objections to phenomenal conservatism. So that's the first thing we should say. Whether the appeal to intuition is dialectically effective also depends, secondly, on whether our dialectical partner or our audience to whom we're giving the argument, or to whom Craig is giving the argument, actually shares the intuition, right? Like if they don't share the intuition, I mean, the appeal to intuition then just seems kind of useless. I mean, it doesn't give them any reason to accept the causal principle. You're just saying like, hey, here's something that I find intuitive. But if they don't find it intuitive, then I don't know, we're kind of at a stalemate, and we haven't really given them any reason to accept the premise. The third,
what if we have a consensus, sorry, amongst philosophers or others?
Okay, so that's a good question. So firstly, we should distinguish a consensus from a consensus of intuitions. So it might be that there's a consensus in believing in something, but there may not be a consensus of people having an intuition in favor of it. Because maybe they just have marshaled various other arguments on behalf of the thing, or they accept it for other reasons. Maybe just inductively speaking, it's a good inductive generalization or whatever. That's very different from a consensus of people sharing the intuition. So that's one thing to say. A second thing to say is that, it's an interesting epistemological question. If, like, the vast majority of philosophers have an intuition that P, and yet someone else, whether they're a philosopher or not, does not intuit that P, does the argument from intuition give them any strong reason to accept that P? I mean, maybe they have some reason to think that, like, they're missing something, I guess. Like, maybe they have some reason to think that their intuitions are somehow defective or they're not getting something. But I don't know. That seems to be very weak by just saying, like, hey, a lot of us philosophers share this intuition. And I know you, dear layperson, don't share this intuition at all. But, like, just trust us, bro. I don't know. That doesn't seem terribly dialectically effective, even if it gives them some weak reason to accept the premise. So that's the second thing to say. And then maybe a third thing to say is just like, well, empirically speaking, we don't yet have evidence that this is a widespread intuition among philosophers. I know philosophers who share the intuition. I know philosophers who, or at least I think I know philosophers who don't share the intuition. And I don't have any empirical evidence that this is a very, like, a super duper widespread or consensus intuition. So that's another thing to mention, but that's a very good question. Okay, the third thing upon which this appeal to intuition depends is like whether or not it succeeds. Of course, it'll depend on whether or not there are defeaters for the intuition, like whether or not there are reasons that sufficiently counterbalance it or that, undercut it, that remove its evidential force, even if we grant that it has evidential force. So, like, maybe we have independent reason to think that our metaphysical intuitions about such matters that are super remote from ordinary humdrum experience are just really unreliable. Where, like, a bunch of people appeal to the significant disagreement in metaphysics, even significant divergence among pretty core basic intuitions, especially about these abstract matters that are far removed from ordinary experience. People here might appeal to evolutionary considerations. Now, you have to be careful because this could turn into a kind of universal acid where you're just like debunking a lot of things that you don't want to debunk. But some people will just say, like, listen, we shouldn't expect us to have reliable intuitions about these abstract matters far removed from our ordinary experience because, like, what did evolution equip us with? Like, we should expect evolution only to be reliable about, like, very humdrum things about, like, how to get around, how to find food, how to get mates, and these various things. Like, we weren't equipped with the tools to be able to, like, divine the fundamental nature of reality or to, like, figure out what happens 13.8 billion years ago, especially these, like, metaphysical intuitions. Like, it's hard to tell a story, at least by some people's lights, for how those intuitions could be reliable, for how they could be truth tracking, maybe for how they could be appropriately latched up to the facts so as to be knowledge conferring. So, like, that's one general possibility for a defeater here for this appeal to intuition is just maybe we have independent reasons to think that our metaphysical intuitions about what requires a cause and under what conditions things require causes and whatnot are unreliable. So that's one thing. Another possible defeater here is that like maybe there are just equally intuitive principles that conflict with the causal principle or the Kalam, right? So like here are some principles that at least some people have claimed to be deeply intuitive and just as intuitive as the Kalam's causal principle, but which can either conflict with the causal principle or conflict with the Kalam itself. So here's one. Every material object that begins to exist has a material cause. That is, some things or stuff from which it's made. So, Felipe Leon has kind of pushed a principle similar to this, and he's argued that, well, like, hey, like if you found out that in the woods somewhere, someone just like spoke into existence, like they just mentally intended something, and boom, it just popped into existence, like like a fully formed log cabin. Felipe Leon's intuition, he's like, that seems impossible. Like it seems like there would have to be some like prior material that you refashioned to make the logs and all that stuff. So, just as it seems implausible for the log cabin to pop into being uncaused, Felipe Leon and I think even Wes Morstan as well in a published paper or papers have argued that like seems equally implausible to suggest that it happened with an efficient cause, but no material cause, with like a log cabin. But yet, like, the Kalam proponent seems to need to say that that sort of thing happened with, the universe. So, there are other principles here that are allegedly equally intuitive to the Kalam's causal principle, but which conflict with it or conflict with the Kalam. So, some people intuit that causes must either be temporally before or simultaneous with their effects. A lot of people just have a deep intuitive revulsion towards timeless to temporal causation. Other people intuit. I know Alex Malpass has intuited this that mental causation, just by its very nature, seems to take time. It's very difficult for us to make sense of like a timeless mental cause. Now, to be clear, I'm not here endorsing these principles, okay? And I'm also not even saying that they might be true. Like I'm not positively making that claim, okay? My point is simply that the defender of the argument from intuition for the causal principle needs to contend with the objection that there are potential defeaters for their appeal to intuition on behalf of the Kalam's causal principle. And one way for there to be defeaters is for there to be equally intuitive principles that conflict with the Kalam or with the Kalam's causal principle. Now, whether these are equally intuitive, I leave it up to the audience, right? Like that's just going to depend on how they see things. But like Kalam proponents, I do think need to contend with these sorts of at least potential defeaters if they are to get us to accept their argument from intuition. And then another point that Wes Morstan makes here is that like given that a number of people do seem to find one or more of these alternative principles intuitive, maybe this suggests that our metaphysical intuitions about the conditions required for there to be, an absolute beginning of time and matter itself may not be especially reliable. Again, I'm not claiming or suggesting that this is or might be true, but again, it's something that proponents of the Kalam will need to deal with. Now, the reason why I keep on saying that is because like I have been jaded from years of experience on this terrible platform. I mean, maybe it's not terrible, but I've been jaded by people attributing things to me and mistaking the sorts of criticisms that I'm making or like attributing things to me where I'm not actually going out on a positive limb and asserting that these are true. Like I'm not positively claiming that mental causation takes time. Like we're examining potential defeaters, undercutting defeaters for the Kalam. The point is that the Kalam proponent would need to show that these aren't equally as intuitive or that these don't undermine their argument from intuition. Okay. So that will be I apologize to the audience, but it will be a repeated theme throughout this discussion where I'm like clarifying the dialectical context because I see so often that people, including professional philosophers, misunderstand the kind of criticism that I'm raising in these, or the kind of the kind of points that I'm making. Okay, so I know that I have just gone on for ages, so I apologize about that. But that is what I have to say about Craig's argument from intuition for the causal principle for the Old Kalam.
Oh my God, that's so tiny of all questions we have, but okay. So I understand you wanted to push those arguments, and I heard from you that you are not really against causal finitism or something like that, but you're just pushing those theses, whether they can stand those criticisms. Is that correct?
Right, yeah, and like with the case of causal finitism, which we're going to get to later, it's not like I'm saying I positively believe, and I don't positively believe that, the universe is infinite towards the past, or that there are or can be infinite causal chains. It's more so just like I'm examining the positive arguments that you guys are giving, and you're trying to say that I'm like, I need to accept this conclusion. I'm examining your positive arguments, saying like, hey, some of these things aren't adequately justified, and like, how do you rule out these alternatives? And like, here's another solution to the paradoxes. Seems kind of plausible. Now, actually, maybe when we go on to the solutions to the paradoxes, I actually do think that there are alternative solutions to the paradox that we should accept instead of causal finitism. But like, yeah, more generally, I think people just way too often mistake me believing something with like offering an undercutting defeater. Like I'm trying to pinpoint alternatives that the proponent of the Kalam would need to rule out in order for their argument to succeed, but where they don't adequately rule those out, or where, at the very least, the task is on them to rule it out. And I'm not like trying to positively propose those alternatives as something that I actively believe, or that I'm claiming is true. Because people will just say to me like, "Oh yeah, Joe, well, like you're saying all these other potential, conceivable causes for the universe. What reason do we have to accept those?" It's like, you're totally misunderstanding the nature of the criticism. Like, Craig is the one who's trying to convince us that the cause of the universe is God. So the burden of proof is on him to rule out these alternatives. The burden of proof is not on me to prove that there's a non-God cause of the universe. Like, what are you talking about? What are you talking? Like, this shows up in court. Like, someone is claiming that someone is guilty. All I need to do as the defense is say, like, listen, here's another candidate for the crime, and you haven't ruled them out, so you haven't established that my dude is actually guilty, and that's totally fine. The person's going to be exonerated if we're in court and that happens, because the burden of proof is on the person who is trying to convince us that, in this case, God is specifically the cause of the universe. Okay, anyway, I'm off my high horse.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Thank you for explanation. So let's move on to the second argument. He says if things really could come into being uncaused of nothing, then it becomes inexplicable. Why just anything or everything does not come into existence uncaused from nothing? So those are really popular words.
Yes, and I say the following in affection for Craig, but he says very rhetorically powerfully, why not basic bicycles and Beethoven or root beer? Why don't they just pop into being out of nothing? Like, why is it only the universe can come into existence uncaused? Like, what makes nothingness so discriminatory? Yeah, so as I understand it, I think, well, there are different ways to precisify this argument. I think one way to precisify it, and maybe the best way, is that, hey, if not everything that begins to exist has a cause, so if the causal principle is false, then we have no explanation for why chaos doesn't just pervade reality. That is, why things don't just spring into existence willy-nilly, uncaused, for no rhyme or reason. And, it's bad if we don't have such an explanation. Like, we need some explanation for why that's not the case. And so that gives us reason to accept the causal principle. Maybe it's the best, maybe it's the only explanation for why that sort of uncaused chaos doesn't pervade reality. Okay, now, off the bat, this argument might just be confusing causation with explanation. So, like, even if something begins to exist without a cause, it doesn't follow that it begins to exist without an explanation, right? There are non-causal explanations, after all. Some accounts of gnomic explanation, so explanation by appeal to laws. Some accounts of gnomic explanation are non-causal. There are structural explanations. There are mathematical explanations. There are grounding explanations. There are explanations by appeal to metaphysical principles. There are explanations by appeal to the impossibility of the contrary or something happening. Like, there are lots of different kinds of explanations here that are not causal in nature. So if the opponent of the causal principle thinks that the universe or its initial state began to exist uncaused, they could still think that it has an explanation. And they could accept the more general principle that whenever things begin to exist, they have explanations for their beginning to exist. But in that case, I don't know, it seems utterly unsurprising that inexplicable chaos doesn't pervade reality. So, like, because you can't have inexplicable chaos. You can't just have inexplicable comings into being uncaused. There need to be explanations, according to these people. Maybe there don't need to be necessarily causes, but there need to be some kind of explanations. And so, like, if the relevant explanatory conditions aren't met for, like, a bicycle to come into existence, then it's not going to, because we have this explanatory principle, not a causal principle, but an explanatory principle, which can rule out that sort of chaos. Now, I have this little parenthetical here, like, I still do think that the following is a good question for people who take this line of response to Craig. It's a good question, the following. I get it. Under, your opponent's view, ordinary things around us require explanations. But still, like, why don't all sorts of things begin to exist around us, explained but still without a cause, right? And maybe we could salvage the original argument by saying that, under this sort of view, we should still expect that things begin to exist around us uncaused, even if they have explanations. Um, so that's one way Craig might try to push back against this response. Like I'm doing my best, to like defend Craig. Um, I don't know though. It seems kind of weak to me. I feel like the opponent here could just like presumably point to certain broader explanatory features of the world and just say that, the explanations that would be needed to explain why ordinary things come into existence around us, like Beethoven, bicycles, root beer, etc., they're just absent. So the relevant explanatory conditions needed for them to come into existence, as I was saying, are just like not present. So then it's like no surprise that those things don't begin to exist around us, explained but without a cause. So I don't know. I've traced out a little bit of a dialectic there. Um, that's like a first response. A second response is just that like, well, hey, maybe there are other ways to rule out uncaused chaos that don't require any causal principle. And of course, again, the burden of proof is on the proponent of the argument in question to rule those out because they're trying to say like, you need the causal principle to prevent chaos from, pervading reality, as it were. If there are alternative ways that don't require the causal principle and which are satisfactory explanations for why that uncaused chaos doesn't pervade reality, then their argument is undercut. So like one proposal here is that like maybe there are certain governing laws that prevent things that prevent the uncaused coming into being of objects like Beethoven bicycles or root beer within spacetime, even if there are no such laws preventing the uncaused beginning of spacetime itself. Again, I'm not saying that this is or might be true. The point is that proponents of the argument for the causal principle need to, roll up their sleeves. I'm rolling up my sleeves right now for the audience who's listening. They need to roll up their sleeves and give us some reason to rule out these alternative explanations for why uncaused things don't just happen all around us. Now, this is not to say that every single proponent of the Old Kalam has failed to do that. I know that there are certain attempts, but my point is like, for people who are interested in this and thinking about this, like, this task needs to be done, and I'll leave it at that. So that's the second response. A third response to the argument from chaos, as I'm calling it, it's just this argument that we've been talking about, is that it might problematically overgeneralize. Like, I don't know. Doesn't it kind of seem like the argument can be applied with appropriate modifications and no seeming loss of plausibility to the Kalam advocate's view that timeless entities don't require a cause? Or, maybe entities that exist in a non-metrical amorphous time, like Swinburne's view and Mullen's view. Doesn't it seems like we could equally ask, like, hey, if things really could timelessly exist uncaused, well then it becomes inexplicable why just anything or everything doesn't timelessly exist uncaused. Or, things which would be timeless if they were to exist. Like, why don't changeless physical things timelessly exist uncaused? Why don't like timeless universal wave functions of various kinds not exist uncaused? Why don't various lower deities who are timeless not exist uncaused timelessly? Why is it that only some entities, such as God, can timelessly exist with no cause? Like if you're allowing that one timeless thing can exist without a cause, why not just all these other hordes of things? Like what explains why those things don't pervade timeless reality, as it were? And again, the idea here is essentially the same as the original argument from chaos. If not everything that timelessly exists has a cause, well, then we have no explanation of why chaos doesn't pervade timeless reality. That is why whole jungles of arbitrary timeless things don't just like exist willy-nilly, uncaused, timelessly, with no rhyme or reason. But echoing Craig, like, hey, doesn't that seems absurd? So like we should conclude by Craig's reasoning, one might think, that even everything timeless has a cause. But proponents of the Kalam don't want to say that. So it's like a parody argument. Now, I think defenders of the argument, of Craig's argument, that is, are probably going to respond that, well, hey, like, I can pinpoint some relevant difference between God and other things, which explains why God and not those things, not those timeless things, would be sort of uniquely uncaused. And, in particular, God couldn't have a cause, given his nature or whatever, given the kind of thing that God is. But, like, I don't know, once you say that, I start to worry. Can't opponents of Craig's argument then just say something like similar, right? Like, I don't know, according to them, maybe they'll just say like, well, listen, unlike any other temporal thing, the initial state of the universe is simply the kind of thing that can't have a cause. And maybe they'll be able to pinpoint some relevant difference between that and other things in time. So maybe they'll try to say like, well, hey, in their view, causation is an essentially temporal relation. ruling out timeless causes. And maybe, the only thing that could cause the temporally first state is something timeless, which by that principle is sort of ruled out. So maybe they'll say that like, no, there is a relevant difference between like the initial state and non-initial things when it comes to having and or requiring a cause. So I don't know. I've sort of traced out this dialectic. I mean, where exactly I fall on whether or not the argument from chaos is a successful argument for the argument for the Kalam's causal principle. I don't know. I am sort of not sure. And for these reasons, I'm sort of I have worries, I'll just say. And like non-trivial serious worries for the argument. Um,
Yes. So can I ask you just why should we think that chaos would exist? Maybe it happens only for black holes or beginning of the universe or some strange things in the cosmos, but not everything. Like why Beethoven need to come to existence if causal principle is false?
yeah. I think the thought maybe really is just like this no relevant difference thought. So like if you're going to try to carve up some distinction among things which can and can't begin to exist uncaused, like you need some kind of like explanation for why you're putting the line there, right? Like why are you saying that, well, everything but black holes needs a cause for its beginning to exist. Like, doesn't that seem kind of arbitrary? Like, what's the relevant difference? What's the relevant difference between black holes and everything else that could explain why that thing in particular can come into existence uncaused, but like nothing else can? And I don't know. It just seems kind of arbitrary, implausible if you're making that arbitrary distinction without some kind of deeper account as to why there is such a why black holes are so privileged. What's so metaphysically special about them that could, as it were, demarcate them from other things when it comes to requiring a cause for beginning to exist. So I think it's a kind of non-arbitrariness charge, an ad hocery charge, and it just seems facially implausible if you're just carving up such distinctions without any independent reason, without adducing um, any relevant difference, some difference between the things, which makes a difference when it comes to requiring a cause for beginning to exist. So I think that's the motivation.
Right. So I always wondered why, if we have a deductive argument, we only need one argument, right? If that's a correct one. But we have here two deductive argument and third is inductive. But why we have multiple evidence? Or like for the second premise, we have four evidence that universe has a beginning. So why four? Why not one if that's so clear and deductive? And I don't know.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I don't know, the more the merrier. Like, I don't know. The more arguments you have for something, I feel like that as long as like here's one reason you might want to have more arguments, even if they're deductive. Even when an argument is deductive, you may not be absolutely certain in all the premises, right? So you might just find the premises like plausible, but like you're not completely sure that they're true. But like still, so like one deductive argument could then, and if that's the case, well, then that argument in and of itself certainly won't be able to get you certainty in the conclusion, right? Because like you're not certain on the premises, so how are you going to get certainty out of it? Like you're not gonna do that, even if it's deductive. That just means that like if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. But if you're only so confident in the premises, it's not like you can bootstrap yourself up to like certainty in the conclusion somehow. Like that's not how reasoning works. Uh, so if we are only like reasonably confident in the premises of one deductive argument, well, it's helpful to have more deductive arguments for the same conclusion because that can bolster your confidence even further. Because maybe those are sort of independent from the first, like you're reasonably confident in those premises as well. And then when you bring in another argument, it's like these independently converging lines of evidence, each of which has plausible in and of itself, and which together can make a very powerful cumulative case. So I think maybe that's even if they're each deductive. So I think maybe that's what's going on.
Yes, okay. And before third argument, can you just say briefly, I wonder what Craig thinks about you? Does he think that you're some smart guy or crazy guy? I don't know how he looks at you and your objections, and I don't know. Seriously.
That's funny. Yeah, no. I mean, I have heard him on Capturing Christianity once describe me in very nice terms, which I'm very grateful for. And uh, and I have also had some private correspondences with him, and he has also um, cited a number of my works. Like one of them certainly like approvingly, I think. And then some other things that he's cited with and just dealt with great respect. So my sense is that both of us have a kind of mutual respect for each other as scholars. Now, of course, we have had, as it were, some temporary spats, on the internet sphere when we make response videos to each other. But that's okay, that happens. And, we've actually since talked to each other since our last spat, and we're on good terms, I think. So, yeah, that's my sense. I mean, I have that sense both from my private correspondences with him, including relatively recent ones, and also what he has said on, Capturing Christianity, and also how he has engaged with me in his scholarly work.
Yeah, but he told me privately that he hates you, so let's continue. Third argument. Inductive argument from scientific and everyday experience, so that every new discovery verify the causal principle, right?
Right. So this is the sort of argument from induction, like inductively speaking, like all of our experience just testifies to this. Scientists, they seem to, whenever they look for a cause, they seem to find one for things that begin to exist. So the thought goes. Yeah, so I mean, opponents will say inductive inferences are liable to defeaters, right? Just as intuitions are, right? So maybe, the unobserved members of the class over which we're generalizing. So unobserved cases of beginning to exist. For instance, maybe like the very beginning of space-time, matter, and energy itself. Maybe those are somehow relevantly dissimilar in some respect to the observed members of the class that we're using to form the inductive base that we're using to generalize over the unobserved class. So like if we have some reason to think that the unobserved members of that class may well be relevantly different to the observed members of the class, which form our inductive evidence base, and from which we're generalizing to the unobserved members, well, then arguably that sort of defeats our inductive generalization. Now, the question then would just be like, are there reasons to think that the unobserved members of this class, the unobserved cases of beginning to exist, including perhaps ones that are very far removed from our ordinary experience, is there some reason to think those are relevantly different from the observed members of this class, like the cases of beginning to exist that we find in our ordinary experience and that scientists have investigated? And I'll just leave that to the audience to think about that. More importantly, though, everyday experience and scientific evidence seem to equally support principles that are incompatible with the causal principle, or at least with the Kalam more generally. So again, I return to some of these principles that I mentioned earlier. Every material object that begins to exist has a material cause, that is, some things or stuff from which it's made. I don't know, that seems to be uniformly confirmed in our everyday experience. Or, causes must either be before or simultaneous with their effects. I mean, scientists have never found, well, we're going to talk about a potentially timeless universal wave function. But like, if you don't take that view, which would arguably undercut the Kalam in other ways. So like, the Kalam proponents aren't going to want to take that view. If we set that view aside, every time scientists have investigated temporal things with causes, their causes themselves are temporally before or simultaneous with them. And likewise, in our ordinary experience, that's just like universally inductively supported. Same with these other principles that like, here's one. Every concrete object has a cause. I don't know, every concrete object that I've come into contact with seems to have a cause. At minimum, in terms of like the preceding states and conditions and causes of the universe. This also happens in science. Like it seems like every concrete object that they've come across, that they've interacted with, has a cause. And also, there's a principle here that like mental causation takes time. So like every instance of mental causation that I'm aware of has taken time, and everyone that scientists have investigated takes time. So like these principles that are incompatible with the Kalam's causal principle, or at least the Kalam more generally, seem to be equally well inductively supported from our everyday experience and from scientific evidence.
Sorry,
so it seems
if we have yeah, let's finish, please.
Oh yeah, I was just going to end very quickly. So I don't know. It seems like the appeal to everyday experience and scientific evidence simply doesn't show that the Kalam's causal principle is true, because like it would equally motivate these other things that are incompatible with it, or at the very least, which are incompatible with broader aspects of the Kalam, such that at the very least, if we're only appealing to this inductive evidence in favor of the Kalam's causal principle, like if we're considering this argument in isolation, then like if we accept it for the causal principle, there is pressure to accept it for these other principles. at least in the absence of defeaters. But if you accept these other principles, then you basically just have to give up on the Kalam. So that's the worry here.
All right, and what if substance dualism is true and we have a soul or spirit or I don't know, something like that? So we can cause some thoughts, and this is immaterial, right? And that's the example where something not material causes, right?
Um, okay, so good question. Notice though how I formulated this, right? This premise, this principle. It says every material object that begins to exist has a material cause, right? So like thoughts under this view, by its own admission, are not material objects, right? So even if thoughts don't have a material cause, uh, that's no counterexample to the principle. The principle says that every material object has a material cause. Every material object which begins to exist has a material cause. And likewise, souls are not material objects. So even if they don't have a material cause, it's no counterexample. Um, I mean, so it's a very good question, but like I don't think that's a good response just because it doesn't even target the principle as stated. And of course, like, well, this gets into tricky dialectical weeds, but like when you appeal to counterexamples to a principle, um, like oftentimes it's good if those counterexamples are like uncontentious. Um, but substance dualism is like far from uncontentious.
Yes, does that same works for A and B theory of time? That's the last question, but can you here address because it seems that most philosophers accept B theory of time according to field papers. So if we appeal to A theory of time, that's like
I think it's
not
going to weaken the
really.
argument. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's definitely going to weaken the argument just because like there are serious, respectable, defensible B theoretic views. And like there are serious arguments for those views as well. And of course, Craig has done his due scholarly diligence. He has like a book or two on philosophy of time, and he's like examined a lot of these arguments. But still, the more extremely controversial metaphysical assumptions that you wed yourself to in your argument, the more ways for your argument to fail. The more ways there are for your argument to fail, to go wrong, the more avenues by which you can push back. Like now, like if you're wedding your argument for either the causal principle or for the second premise of the Kalam, the empirical premise, if you're wedding those to a particularly contentious view in the philosophy of time, well then like now your defense of the Kalam like just has like maybe like a dozen or two more objections to it that you would have to contend with because there are like at least a dozen or two probably arguments for the B theory of time or objections to the A theory. So it should basically just like correspondingly it should decrease one's confidence in the success of the argument the more you wed yourself to these controversial metaphysical views. But yeah, that's a very good
Yes,
point.
amazing. But again, we have Andrew Lowe. His version of Kalam is compatible with B theory of time. Also, Alexander Pruss endorses B theory of time, but still has his new version. So, is that
Right, yeah.
better option maybe?
Yeah, so I mean this is a good point. I do think that versions of the Kalam which do not wed themselves to the A theory are, at least other things being equal, much stronger for that very reason. Yeah. And yeah, when I was saying earlier, I should not have been, audience, don't interpret me as saying like all versions of the Kalam require this. Like there are different defenses that you can run for the Kalam and the Old Kalam. Some of the defenses of the premises and whatnot like don't appeal or don't require the A theory. But like some of them definitely do. Especially some Craig's.
Amazing. So let's continue with third question. Actually, that's the second. So Andrew Locke said, nothing can prevent something from happening once it has already occurred. So I just wonder, what do you think on this question?
Yeah, so I mean, nothing can prevent something from happening once it has already occurred. I mean, um, as stated, it's not exactly clear what ex I mean, insofar as I understand this claim, because like, okay, nothing can prevent something from happening once it has already occurred. So I feel like we just have to be careful with some of our time indexing to like when the prevention happens and when we. But anyway, I think I understand what this claim is, and insofar as I understand it, I agree with it, because like if the thing has already occurred. How could you prevent it? To prevent something is basically to make it the case that it doesn't occur. So if it's already occurred, then you can't make it the case that it doesn't occur simpliciter, right? So that seems right to me. Now, there is a second conjunct here. You say any genuine prevention must take place prior to the events coming into existence. I mean, so one thing to mention here is that I'm not sure if this is like universally true. It may be the case that there's some kind of possibility for retrocausation, where like later things cause or prevent earlier things from happening. Um, it's a little weird, yeah, I grant that. But like I would want some, argument to rule that out. Um, and also, uh, you know, to explain why something doesn't happen, or to explain why even why something does happen, I don't think we need to appeal to some sort of like, or at least I'm not yet convinced on the basis of arguments that are adduced in this literature. I'm not convinced that we need something which like serves as a causal prevention of it, or that serves as like a causal production of it. I'm much more open to these. Well, I'll just say I don't see how we rule out the non-causal explanations some of the non-causal explanations that I used earlier, and other ones that we just haven't even thought of. So I'll just be brief on that, and I'll leave it there.
Okay, let's continue with his argument about first cause. It must be personal with freedom of will. So he says, first, it needs to have a capacity to be the originator of the event in a way that it's undermined by any prior event, since the first cause is the first. Yeah, and second, the capacity to prevent itself from changing. So, what do you think on this?
Yeah. So this is a sort of argument for thinking that the first cause has some sort of libertarian free will, I suppose. So I don't think that this is a successful argument for thinking that the first cause must have libertarian freedom. I personally see nothing incoherent or inconceivable about some impersonal substance without an intellect or will having those abilities. I don't see it. I don't see anything incoherent about an impersonal substance having those abilities. And as far as I can tell, as far as I can tell, no one has given a good reason for why only an intellect and will, or only a being endowed with intellect and will, only a personal being with libertarian freedom could have those abilities. At bottom, um, I strongly suspect that's just a bare assertion, or rests on other bare assertions or bare appeals to intuition, which I don't share. And I don't know, impersonal things can prevent themselves from doing things. And also, like, we have totally coherent models of impersonal things having the ability to cause events without being determined by prior events. So, like, what's so incoherent about, combining those things in an impersonal thing? I don't see anything incoherent about that. That makes total conceptual sense to me.
Yes, amazing. Let's go next. So, Richard Swinburne in his book says that we have only two kinds of explanations, like scientific or personal. So, Dr. Craig wants to say that this is a good argument that if we have a beginning of space-time universe, so it must be a personal explanation. So, what do you think?
Yeah, so I mean I just think it is like decisively, like certainly false that the only kinds of explanations are personal and scientific. Like that, like what are you talking about? Like there are grounding based explanations. There are mathematical explanations. Like that, it's not like science when mathematicians are like, giving explanations for why certain things follow from other things. And that's also not a personal explanation. Like what are you talking about? Um, again, grounding based explanations. So explanations of less fundamental things in terms of more fundamental things, which, as it were, metaphysically determine or generate them in some sense. Um, Again, that's not going to be like a scientific or personal explanation. There are structural explanations, explanations by appeal to the impossibility of the contrary of something happening. Like again, there are moral explanations. Like why is such and such a moral fact true? Well, you appeal to certain wrong-making features of the act or something. Like they make it wrong. They explain why it's wrong. So it's like clearly false that the only explanations are either scientific or personal. Now, you could restrict this. You could say, okay, fine, but like again, Joe, we're talking about causal. We're talking about causal explanations here because like apparently we just inferred that there's a cause of the universe. So okay, the only causal explanations are either scientific or personal. Okay, that's a more plausible claim. Um, Oh, I should say, I'm not attributing. I'd have to go back. I think I have seen someone claim. I'm not saying who, but I think I've seen someone claim that the only kinds of explanation are scientific and personal. Now that is decisively false, but I'm not here attributing that claim to Craig or others. I'll leave it up to the audience to do the sleuthing on that. But
I heard that also. I don't know
so
where,
that's
but yeah, for certainly. Yeah.
yeah. So that is false. But like, okay, what if we make it this more plausible claim? I just wanted to say I'm not like attributing that obviously false view to, Craig or whatever. Like I'm not doing that right now. Um, okay. Now, what if we say that the explanations are, causal explanations? Those have to be either scientific or personal. And hey, Joe, we're talking about causal explanations in the context of the Kalam, aren't we? Yes. Okay. That's a more plausible claim, but it's so false. I mean, like, I don't know, or at least I don't see any good reason to accept it. I see nothing incoherent about an impersonal cause which is beyond the purview of science, and that science just either can't investigate or doesn't investigate. Like, I don't know, people have believed in lots of different things like this. Like, there are impersonal Advaita Vedanta schools where they posit Brahman, which is just like this infinite, impersonal, aperspectival, pure consciousness or pure bliss or pure being itself or something like just this impersonally conceived ultimate reality. Um, it's a weird, I don't know, it's an odd view. But like, is that incoherent? Does it make no sense whatsoever? I don't know. It seems coherent. I can like conceive of it, and it sounds like it seems like maybe like millions, maybe billions of people throughout history have been able to make sense of that. So, that's an impersonal, non-scientific causal explanation. If this thing is like causally responsible for things in the world, which totally seems conceivable. Um, there are other views here. I can imagine an impersonal point particle-like object that just exists timelessly and isn't amenable to our scientific investigation or scientific explanatory practices. Again, like these things seem coherent to me. I see no contradiction or other obvious impossibility in them. So, like, I don't see a good reason to think that the only causal explanations that there could be are like scientific or personal. And there are others too, which we'll have cause to shortly return to, because one of your questions coming up very shortly is just running through some other conceivable alternative candidate causes for the universe, or at least candidate things for like what the fundamental nature of reality is, apart from, like God as traditionally conceived.
Thank you, Joe. Let's proceed next. So, Craig wants to say also that if we have a beginning of the universe, then the only candidates that are eternal outside of time, space, and matter are abstract objects like numbers or an unembodied mind consciousness. So, are there any third options?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think this is one of the most implausible arguments that I've come across in the Kalam debate. It's just I find there to be no plausibility here. Again, like very shortly, we're going to go through just like hordes upon hordes of things that aren't lines, but also aren't numbers, which conceivably, coherently cause the universe. So, like the Neoplatonic one, we're going to talk about the Brahman that I just mentioned, the Tao or whatever. Like there are certain views about a non-spatiotemporal universal wave function, which might be able to do the task. Like tons of different things. I mean, we're going to go through this very shortly, but like this argument is not plausible. Now, like one thing I will say is that we need to be very careful on how we're using the term universe. Like sometimes we just mean like our local spatiotemporal manifold. Um, this like basically like the observable universe and anything else that we could like causally interact with and which goes back 13.8 billion years ago, which at least started to expand 13.8 billion years ago. But we might also mean, or we might instead mean like the totality of all physical reality. If that's what we mean, well, then the arguments for the finitude of the past don't actually support the conclusion that the universe in that sense began to exist. Because those arguments don't show that there can't be something physical existing before the beginning of metric time in a non-metric time. So like a time for which there's no objective fact of the matter about how long it is, about its duration. And they also don't show that there can't be physical things existing timelessly. And in fact, there just are like live proposals that philosophers of physics and physicists are debating on which there can be timeless physical things. So anyway, if by universe we mean the totality of all physical reality, then even if we proved that like our local spatiotemporal manifold started 13.8 billion years ago, even if we proved that past time can't be infinite, even if we proved that there can only be finite causal chains, that still would not get us to the universe beginning to exist in the sense of universe at issue here, where by universe we mean the totality of physical reality. So like that's something that I want to caution us about. But anyway, we can continue on.
Very good. Thank you again. So, last argument that Craig gives for personal cause of the universe is that we cannot imagine any other way that something that is timeless produces some effect that is temporal. So,
Yeah, I mean, like one response there is like, okay, so you can't imagine another way. Does it follow that there's not another way? No. Maybe this is just a limit to your imagination. Maybe we're just these like pathetic finite creatures who struggle to think about things, you know? So that's an alternative explanation of why we struggle to think of one. And which doesn't advert to the fact that there are none. It's like that's one thing to say. Like it doesn't follow that there are none. But like secondly, yeah, I don't know. I can make totally coherent sense of there being non-free will possessing timeless things which cause a temporal effect. And bring about a beginning without any prior determining conditions. I mean, again, like we have totally coherent models of non-deterministic or indeterministic physical causation, impersonal causation. And like, why couldn't there just be like a substance, an impersonal substance existing timelessly, which exerts that kind of natural spontaneity, that kind of indeterministic causing of the beginning of the universe without any determining prior conditions? I don't know. I don't see anything incoherent with that. And I don't think people have adequately ruled that out in this literature.
yes, it makes sense. Thanks so much. And I spoke with Michael Humer, and he wants to say something similar for fine tuning. People often say, "Oh, is it design or is it multiverse?" But often in science, we have something that we didn't even think of. So maybe there is something that we need to discover yet. So yeah, we shouldn't say, "I cannot think of anything else." So probably those are true, right?
Right, like we should be very careful about those sorts of inferences. And I think yeah. No, that I think we should be very careful about those.
Okay, so next question is I can read. Can you briefly comment on each of the following suggestions, explaining what it is and how it could serve as a cause of the universe? So I have dozen of. Uh,
Well, I'll go through them. I will go through them. So you
yeah,
don't need to read them
just
out.
say
I'll go through
I
them.
found all those in your book. I think maybe not all, but most of those. So I'm not sure if I collected those correctly. Maybe there is some repetitions, but yeah, please go all.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I'll start with like a broader meta point about the dialectic because every, okay, maybe that's a slight exaggeration. Almost every time I talk about this on YouTube, like you get the commenters, it's like, well, what positive reason do we have to posit these alternatives? They're like, why should I believe that? It's like, you, sir, you commenter, you, ma'am, who are going to comment that, you are missing the point. I'm pointing at you. You are missing the point. Okay. Okay, so here's my broader point. Before I get into these, I have to do this because like otherwise, and even still, people are going to do it, right? Like this is not going to stop them. I'm sorry. Okay. The burden of proof is not on the detractor of the Kalam to show that any of the following hypothesized realities exist or even possibly exist. Like I'm not trying to give you a positive argument that these things are like likely or that they're even like metaphysically possible. I'm not or I'm not trying to argue that positively. Uh, I'm trying to give an undercutting defeater. I'm trying to show that the proponent of the Kalam hasn't ruled these things out, and so the proponent of the Kalam has not shown that the cause of the universe must be God. They haven't adequately justified that premise. I mean, an undercutting defeater is supposed to remove the justification for something that someone else is claiming, and by pinpointing these relevant, alternatives, these alternative conceivable causes, coherent causes for or coherent candidates for what the cause of the universe might be, and showing that the Kalam proponent hasn't ruled them out, that just shows that the Kalam proponent hasn't adequately shown that, God specifically is the cause of the universe. So I don't want the audience to think that I positively believe any of these proposals are or might be true. The purpose here is to point out that in the current dialectical context, the proponent needs to show that God exists. And so they need to rule out these non-God candidates. All I'm discussing, or all I'm doing in discussing these hypotheses is just pointing out that there are many coherent, conceivable alternatives to God as the cause of the universe, which the Kalam proponent must systematically rule out if they want the Kalam to show that God exists. And most proponents of the Kalam, in my experience, have not successfully ruled out these alternatives in their argument, in their stage 2 Kalam reasoning. Okay? Okay, so let's go on to some of these. Now, the difficulty these is like they're supposed to be just like ineffable entities that we can say very little about. Um, so like, the Neoplatonic one. So if you go back to like Plotinus, he has this book. I'm sorry, I'm not a historian of philosophy, so I'm probably gonna butcher some things, but he's got this book called the Enneads. I think that's how it's pronounced. And he's a Neoplatonic philosopher. So he's like influenced by the Platonist tradition, but it's like revived later on, and like modified in certain ways. And he develops this view on which there's this like sole ultimate fundamental reality, the one. That's what he calls it, the one. Okay. And like one way that we can interpret the one, I'm not saying that this is exactly what Plotinus himself said. I think there might be um like disagreement about how exactly Plotinus conceived of the one. But like one way that you can interpret it as just this impersonal, ultimate, absolutely simple reality. So it's supposed to be ineffable in some strong sense, as I understand it. Like, other than some very general positive claims about what category or what kind of thing it is, like we can only make like negative claims about it. So those general claims about the category of thing that it is are like it's a concrete object. So it has the ability to cause or at least ground things. And in particular, it's this absolutely simple um, explanation for the diversity and compositeness of things. Um, again, it's absolutely simple. It has no parts, whether physical or mental. We can construe it impersonally, so it's not like it has an intellect or a will or desires. It doesn't act on intentions or anything like that. Maybe it's beyond space and time, and it explains why everything else has parts which are unified together to compose a whole. So again, it's not like there's more that I can say here. Like the whole point is just that this thing is like a really hard to describe fundamental reality, um, which is like very transcendent. Um, and it has some analogies. A number of these have analogies to the classical theistic God as like Thomists conceive of God, just like minus the personal attributes that Thomists ascribe to this fundamental reality. Um, but like I don't know, seems at least like coherent, conceivable in very minimal sense. Um, the Neoplatonic one impersonally construed. So that's like one candidate that people would have to rule out. This like non-spatial, non-temporal, impersonally construed, absolutely simple, fundamental reality which explains the rest of reality. Brahman is something very similar. So there are personalist schools within Advaita Vedanta Hinduism, uh, and just philosophy more generally. But there are also impersonalist schools. So the impersonalist schools hold that ultimate reality, this ultimate fundamental reality called Brahman, is impersonal and it's pure infinite consciousness or being itself without any further form or qualities or internal differentiation. So it's not like it's consciousness with like from a first person perspective associated with like an agent. It's what they say it calls aperspectival consciousness. It's just like pure consciousness. It's almost like this sea, as I kind of think of it. It's like this ever-pervading sea of just like consciousness or something. Yeah, I mean, it's again odd, but is it incoherent? I don't know. Where's your deductive a priori proof of its incoherence? I'd like to see that, and you should try to publish that because there are lots of Advaita Vedanta like philosophers, and there seem to be like millions of people, maybe billions of people who can make total sense of this. Um, or at the very least, when I say make total sense of it, like maybe well, by that I just mean like they don't see any incoherency or they don't see any inconceivability in a sense that would indicate impossibility with this sort of reality. Okay, a similar thing that applies to certain traditions about the Tao as a fundamental reality. So, like, um, I know Tyler McNabb has some work on the Tao and like connecting it to classical theism, but we can construe this impersonally as well. So the Tao is like this ultimate, unchangeable, ineffable source and ordering principle of all things. It's not like a personal creator or agent. It precedes and generates the multiplicity of the world. Um, but itself, it sort of remains beyond ordinary description and categorization. There's this quote in the Taoist tradition, I think, which is like, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. Like, oh. And instead of acting through like deliberate intention, the Tao operates through a kind of spontaneous, natural kind of unfolding. Uh, I'll leave it at that. Um, okay, so now on to maybe some more like some more, I guess I'll say scientifically respectable approaches. maybe there's like a non-spatial or aspatial universal wave function, which is sort of explanatorily prior to the universe. So in quantum mechanics, the state of a system is often said to be specified by an object that we call either the wave function or the state vector. And in quantum cosmology, the state of the entire universe is understood to be, in principle, represented by a wave function that is called a universal wave function. Now, physicists and philosophers of physics often use the term wave function to refer to both a bit of mathematics, so like a bit of formalism in a theory, for instance, and to a physical object represented by that mathematics. And people can check my book with Dan Linford, section 8.3 for references and citations here. We talk about like Alyssa Ney, Jill North, Julian Barber, etc., for further explanations of this stuff. Now, the universal wave function is just, that very object when it comes to the wave function of the entire universe. So the object represented by the relevant bit of mathematics. Now, physicists and philosophers of physics, they disagree about what exactly this object is. Okay, so in addition to the abstract kind of, I guess, theoretical characterization that I just gave. So some think that it's a field, either defined on configuration space or on some more exotic state space. Others think that it's a field defined on superspace, which is just like the space of possible configurations of space-time. So that's like a higher dimensional, as I understand it, a higher dimensional space. Others think that it's a field defined, others think that it's a state vector in Hilbert space, and some views take the wave function to be non-temporal, so timeless, in addition to non-spatial. Okay, so we don't need to get into all the physical concepts here. I don't even pretend to understand everything here myself. Like, like a lot of this I'm drawing from my discussions with Dr. Dan Linford, who is a professional philosopher of physics and with whom I co-wrote the book. So I'm not sort of pretending myself to understand everything here. I just think that there's good reason to believe that this proposal is coherent. It's conceivable. And it's also conceivable that something like a non-spatial temporal universal wave function serves as the cause, or at least some kind of generating explanation of the spatiotemporal universe, including its beginning. And again, my point is just that like proponents of the Kalam would need to rule this out in order to try to infer that the cause of the universe must be God. Okay, I know I sound like a broken record, but I gotta do this, bro.
Okay, so you believe that this is the cause of the universe. Okay,
Right,
continue.
yes. Oh, of course I do. Yes, thank you. Okay. The next one that you had on your list was like a foundational quantum field. I mean, there is overlap with the universal wave function because like, well, one prominent view about its nature is just that it is a kind of quantum field. But maybe there are other kinds of quantum field that one might appeal to, which can exist non-spatial temporally. I mean, like what's incoherent about that? Okay, so you said you you had in the list a singularity. My understanding, and the physicist can correct me, is that a singularity is just like a point or maybe a region where like the mathematical description of a physical theory breaks down. At least typically because certain quantities become either infinite or undefined at that point, according to the theory, like density or, like space-time curvature. And my sense is that like singularities are indicators that the theory which posits them has sort of gone wrong somewhere. Like, it's reached its limits, and that researchers need like a future theory to either replace that theory or to like supplement it or like fix that aspect of the theory with a better physical description and which replaces the singularity or singularities. That's my understanding. So like maybe this one isn't the best proposal. So let's turn to a zero-dimensional point. I think Quentin Smith in one of his papers, and maybe we cite it in the book, but I think Quentin Smith proposes that there might have been some sort of causally efficacious object which either is a point or is the size of a point, and which is like non-spatiotemporal, and which is like causally prior to the beginning of the universe. I believe that's in Quentin Smith. I don't have the reference off the top of my head. I probably should have prepared that beforehand, but that's okay. I'm imperfect. Okay. Collection of fundamental particles. So this is more so a thought about like what could serve as like the foundation of reality, which is like the most fundamental bits of reality, instead of a proposal for what might serve as the cause of the universe. But like we can imagine, I don't know, that there's like one or more fundamental particles which just exist changelessly in some non-temporal spatial arena or dimension, causally prior to the beginning of the universe, or maybe in some non-metric time. So if you think that they have to be temporal, we could posit that, maybe there's some non-metric time prior to the beginning of metric time. Non-metric time itself features in certain live, as far as I know, live cosmological models, like ones developed by Roger Penrose. Mariological or physical symbols, this is something very similar. Like Mariological symbols are just things which don't have any parts. Um, so again, these are just like simple objects, which could likewise serve as either the foundation, could as in the sense of like conceivability or coherence, could likewise serve as the foundation of reality or maybe the cause of the universe. Um, Superstrings now, like maybe this depends on our physical theorizing. I know that like string theory is certainly not a consensus. But like strings are these tiny one-dimensional vibrating entities. Different vibrations of these strings correspond to like different particles. And you can kind of like unify all the different forces, including gravity, according to like string theorists, as I understand it, into a kind of single quantum framework. Again, I don't understand all the details about string theory, but like it's another proposal for like kinds of physical entities that we might not have thought of, but which seem like coherent, and which we might put to use in our metaphysical theorizing, or like at the very least, we might suggest as a conceivable cause of the beginning of the universe. Um, this one's interesting. The priority monist universe. Okay, so priority monism is the view that the whole cosmos is metaphysically or explanatorily prior to its various parts. So, oftentimes when we think of composite objects, we think of like the composite objects as like built up out of and less fundamental than their parts. So, like my water bottle, um, existing kind of just like is explained by or dependent on, in addition to like the historical causal factors that produced it, also like right here and right now, it's particles and it's particles being arranged in a certain way. Like it's sort of constituted, like my water bottle just depends on the particles, and the particles depend on maybe the subatomic particles, right? There's some kind of explanatory dependence there, where like the macro thing is the way it is right now, at least in part because of the way that its parts are. So its parts are, as it were, kind of explanatorily prior to the whole. They come before it, and they kind of explain why it's here and why it has the character that it has. Um, Priority monists think that it's the other way around, at least when it comes to the universe. So the universe is just this unified cosmic object which explains its parts rather than the other way around, the parts explaining it. And so like the parts are, as it were, like fragments of the whole that are kind of like abstracted from the whole. Um, Jonathan Schaffer has a really nice paper like uh, Monism, the Priority of the Whole, or something. I think that's in Phil Review. Very good paper. People can check that out for like an explanation of what priority monism is. But Philip Goff has this interesting proposal where like, okay, maybe priority monism is true, and the universe is like the cosmos is the fundamental reality. And also, the cosmos is responsible for the beginning of time. How could that be? Well, maybe the universe itself had a timeless phase of its existence or a timeless portion of its existence. Like I don't want to say a period, but like some state in which the cosmos, exists timelessly. And maybe that state of it caused the beginning of time, caused the temporal phase of the cosmos. Or maybe, the universe was timeless sans creation, and then through some sort of, some sort of like causal activity, some sort of exercise of its causal power, it then, as it were, was temporal since the beginning of time. Like it exercises causal power in some way to cause the first change, and thereafter it was sort of temporal. Again, very similar to like Craig's timeless sans creation proposal, where like God kind of enters time after he causes the beginning of the universe. Or maybe the priority monist cosmos had a non-metrically temporal phase prior to the beginning of metric time, and such that the universe in that phase caused the beginning of metric time. It sort of brought it about that the universe starts evolving forward in metrically temporal time. So I don't know. This is an interesting proposal that Philip Goff has given, where it's like a causally or explanatorily prior phase or state of the universe itself is responsible for the beginning of the beginning of metric time. So that's an interesting proposal. Other proposals here, like matter, energy, again, like the arguments for the finitude of the past. You might think, well, Joe, like, didn't we establish that all of matter and energy, all of it came into existence a finite time ago? But it's like, no, if you actually look at the arguments, especially the philosophical arguments of the finitude of the past, they just get you that, like, metric time has a beginning. But that's compatible with like matter and energy causally pre-existing the beginning of metric time because maybe they existed somehow in a non-metric time, or maybe somehow there's some way in which, or some way in which those things, forms of them can exist timelessly. Again, like the proponent of the Kalam needs to rule this out. Dynamic physical principles, you included this one as well. I don't remember the details of this one. I just remember that there's a paper by David Gunn, he's a philosopher, on the ultimate origination of things in a very good journal, Philosopher's Imprint, where the audience can go and check this out for like what exactly this proposal is. But he just proposes that dynamic physical principles serve as like the fundamental, the foundation of reality, as it were. Now this one is a theistic solution. But instead of going classical theistic, you might go non-classical theistic. So there are various non-classical theistic models of God where, God lacks one or more of simplicity, immutability, timelessness, and impassibility. So there's a panentheistic way you could go. There are other ways you could go here. One might propose that like module tropes, like there's some sort of like module trope. That's the kind of object which is the cause of the universe. It's like, what are tropes? Tropes are just like particular property instances. So like this very black. So not just like black, which is shared among all black things, is a kind of universal, which multiple particulars participate in or instantiate or exemplify. But like, no, this particular property instance, this black, which is like right here, that's what a trope is. And that's a particular view about the nature of properties. It's a controversial view, but like again, the point is that proponents of the Kalam would need to rule this sort of thing out. Okay, so tropes, that's what a trope is. What is a module trope? Well, a module trope is a particular kind of trope. It's like a self-contained and independently existing trope. So it's almost like a substance, kind of, but it's still a property instance. Okay, and module tropes are distinguished from modifier tropes. Modifier tropes are like dependent modifications of substances. So they can't like exist on their own. They always have to like be associated with or modify a substance. So maybe you think like, okay, blackness can't just be floating out there. Or like, a particular instance of blackness also just can't be floating out there. It has to modify a subject, right? It has to like modify a substance, like my shirt or whatever. I know the audience wants me to take it off very, very badly, and I'm like tempting them, but you're not going to get that. Okay, that's what a module trope is, or a module. That's what a modifier trope is. It has to modify a substance. But like that's different from a module trope. So there are philosophers who just propose that maybe at bottom, fundamental nature of reality, like there just are these self-standing, self-contained, independently existing property instances which don't need to like modify a pre-given substance or like a prior substance. Joshua Sijuwadi has recently popularized the idea that God is a simple omnipotence module trope. So people can check out the work of Joshua Sijuwadi. He has lots of references and resources that he cites in defense of trope theory and module tropes. But you could say the same thing about like a non-divine being. Like maybe there's just, I don't know, some non-divine module trope which caused the universe. Like, how do proponents of the Kalam rule that out? Like you need to do that, right? If you want to infer that God is the cause of the universe. Okay. There are also other proposals here, like, maybe simulators are running our universe. Yeah.
Sorry,
Now
can I
that
say,
one, yeah, go on.
Tom Jump said in a discussion with me that it is more probable that we have some crazy kid from the future causing the universe than omnipotent God or something like that. So, what do you
Okay,
think?
so I vehemently disagree with that, but I think that's false. But listen, like, yeah, I mean, we don't need to go into the simulation hypothesis. I mean, this is not my area of research, but also like I think for various reasons it does land you in a skeptical scenario, and I think that's really, really, really implausible. But we don't need to go into that. I'll just register my disagreement with Tom Jump about that. But like, okay, some people have proposed that simulators are somehow like the cause of the universe. Now, of course, you could ask about like their physical reality, like presumably it's temporal. So like, does that have to have a first cause? You could try to run arguments for that. But at the very least, like, if our scientific observations only apply to things within the simulation, like, we're gonna miss out on the scientific case for the beginning of the universe, we might think. Because like, I mean, who knows? Like, they might have slightly different laws, law structures that operate in base reality. Like who knows what their science and their physics indicates. Um, but again, like you could still run some of the philosophical arguments for the finitude of the past, and those would arguably apply to the non-simulated reality as well. in any case, I'm just going to continue. You could, of course, just go with the classical theistic God, so a God who's absolutely simple, impassible, immutable, timeless, and which has all the other super cool divine attributes. That's one way you could go. I know, again, these aren't like non-theistic alternatives. We included two theistic alternatives, which is fine. And then there are like deistic beings, which aren't quite theism because like they just like kick the universe, they kick it going, and then they just kind of do their thing and they don't really pay attention to what happens thereafter. That's like an option that one might take. Again, conceivable, but I recognize that like oftentimes proponents of the Kalam aren't wanting to get so fine-grained that they establish like all the divine attributes as opposed to deism. Like they're going to want to say like, listen, dude, in order to rule that out, I'm just going to give you other arguments. Like that's fine. But like you can't even like we're definitely not even getting to something like close to God if there's like a non-spatiotemporal physical object, which is like which is like posited by physicists and which is responsible for, the beginning of metric time. So like again, most of these things I do think pose undercutting defeaters to the case that Kalam proponents make. Okay. I think we're now ready for the
Good
new
job.
Kalam. Thank you.
No, wait. I need to ask you this. What is the best explanation of all those 18? So maybe what is the best theistic or something like that? And second, what is the best scientific answer for the cause of the universe? I need to hear that.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I mean, part of the problem here is that it's going to depend on our total evidence base, right? So like if you're a religious theist, for instance, you're going to have to take into account what your religion says about God's nature. If if you're a classical theist, if you're a non-classical theist, like I don't know, it just depends on lots of debates in models of God, which theistic view you should take. So I hesitate to answer that question. Um, I mean, if you want to know what what I think is the best theistic approach, all things considered, it would be some non-Thomistic version of classical theism. Now, that might be surprising to people that I say that, but I think a lot of the arguments that I have pushed in the past against classical theism distinctively target a kind of Thomistic classical theism and like very high octane classical theistic views. But I think that there are other classical theistic views, like classical theism is just a broader tradition than Thomism. And I think that there are certain highly respectable um, classical theistic views that are non-Thomistic and which I think are the best theistic views. Okay, in light of the total evidence, I should say. Okay, so that's my answer to the theist question. As for
Sorry, is it like Ryan Mullin's version of God? Because that's what I like most. So, what do you think? Is that like model of God that you are talking about, or
Oh,
what?
well, good question. So I myself wouldn't go in for that one, but that's not to say that I think that that is just like irrational. I don't think it's like irrational to go in for that. Or I don't think one's like necessarily being irrational. Like I think that there are um but like I wasn't referring to that to answer your question. Like I would be attracted to something which is actually a little bit more um properly classical theistic than that one. Like I would go in for like full-blown timelessness, for instance. And I think that there are various like theoretical desiderata that we can achieve by doing that. But again, like that's a topic for another day. And again, I don't think that like one is necessarily irrational for disagreeing with that, of course. But let's turn then to like what's the best atheistic candidate? Yeah, that's a really good question. Um, I mean, maybe it'll depend on whether you want to be a naturalist or a non-naturalist atheist, right? Like a non-naturalist atheist, like honestly, maybe that view about like Brahman or something. Because like, I don't know, it's hard to fit consciousness into a naturalistic picture of reality. So I feel like if you're not a naturalist, it's maybe going to be because you have some like spooky views. Like maybe you think that there are like, I don't know, like higher beings than us running amok, like angels and demons, or maybe you think that like um there is something really spooky and kind of crazy about consciousness. If you're not a naturalist, but you're still an atheist, then maybe the best thing to do there, if you're not a naturalist, is to go in for Brahman, or something like that. But if you're a naturalist, what's the best thing to do? Well, I think you should hew very closely to what science says. Um, and in that case, I think you should probably maybe put most of your credence in the kind of non-spatiotemporal universal wave function because I don't know, it has a like there's a growing I don't want to say it's a consensus, but it's like a growing view in philosophy of physics that, space-time is not fundamental. It's somehow explained by, generated by something deeper, which is non-spatiotemporal, and that can afford you maybe something like the non-spatiotemporal universal wave function. So anyway, I didn't prepare in advance for that question, but I hope that that's my view about the best theistic candidate and the best naturalistic candidate and the best non-naturalistic candidate. I hope I did well. We're just gonna have to move on.
Good job. Thank you so much. So we have a half an hour for a new Kalam argument. So that's, I think, very little. But do you want to add anything for the first question? Because you already said something, but do you have anything more to say on difference and which version is better? So
Yeah, so I will I've already distinguished the Old Kalam and the New Kalam. So I'll just lay out the premises of the Old Kalam, of the New Kalam as Alexander Pruss articulates them in his 2018 book Infinity, Causation, and Paradox. So according to Pruss, it has three premises and a conclusion. The first premise is that nothing has an infinite causal history. That follows from his view of causal finitism, which I will defend I will clarify what it is momentarily. I will not defend causal finitism. Sorry. Okay, the second premise is that there are no causal loops. So a causal loop is a circular causal chain. So like a causal chain where X directly causes itself or indirectly causes itself by causing something which causes something which eventually gets back to X itself. Okay. So that's the second premise. There are no causal loops. Third premise is that something has a cause. And from those, it follows that there is at least one uncaused cause, right? Because if something has a cause, well then, okay, here's something that has a cause. Okay, well, this series of causes, we've got the series, it at least has, two nodes in it, right? An effect and a cause. It can't go back infinitely, given that first premise, that nothing has an infinite causal history. Okay, so it's got to be finite. Okay, well then it either loops back on itself or it doesn't. Well, it can't loop back on itself, right? Because there are no causal loops per the second premise. So that means it's a finite causal history which doesn't loop back on itself, which means there's a first node which doesn't have a cause, okay? So it follows that there's an uncaused cause. That's how the argument works. That's why it's valid. Now, he does have this premise that something has a cause. How likely do I think that premise is, given that, yeah, some people do deny it. Some people think that there's no such thing as causation. I find that, manifestly implausible. I'm sorry, but it's close to a Morian fact that I'm causing myself to drink water right now. I don't know what to tell you, dude. If you've got a philosophical theory or a scientific theory which implies that that no causal interactions occurred there, you're just wrong. Okay, so sorry. That's my view. Now, yeah. There are complicated debates here about whether causation is fundamental. Strictly speaking, this argument does not require that causation is fundamental. It's compatible with causation being non-fundamental and causal interactions being explained by, deeper fundamental features of reality or maybe being reducible to other sorts of relations between things. The argument is compatible with that. And for the purpose of our discussion, I'm not going to take a stand on whether or not causation is reducible or fundamental. So yeah.
Yes, very good. Graham Opie said something similar. He says if you don't endorse idealism or solipsism, then it seems likely that there is some causation. I don't know. So yeah,
even idealism, there's causation in my mind. Idealism, and even solipsism. If my mind is the only thing that exists, still, even if I don't know, it feels like there are still causal interactions going on in my mind that I could be aware of, but.
Yeah, I don't know. So that's really hard. Thank you. Okay, so what about the premise that there is no circle of causes? So I read some other version from Pruss, but yeah, it's almost.
Yeah, there are no causal loops, no circles of causes. That's the same premise. So, you mentioned that there's this grandfather paradox in your email to me. The thought is if circles of causes were possible, then time travel would be possible, and you could go back and kill your grandfather. But that doesn't make any sense because that would engender some sort of contradiction or impossibility or absurdity, and so it follows that there can't be circles of causes. I'm not sure I buy that argument. I'm very tempted by just a deflationary, flat-footed solution to grandfather paradoxes, where we just say no, you couldn't kill your grandfather. Even if you could go back in time to kill your grandfather, it's false. Or sorry, even if you could travel back in time, it's false that you could kill your grandfather without him like being resurrected or resuscitating and giving birth to you. I just think like my response to that premise is that, well, no, like if you could go back in time, just then any world in which you attempted to kill your grandfather, you would either fail, like maybe you'd slip on a banana peel, or maybe like you'd shoot the gun, like a bird would fly in the way at the last moment and you'd kill the bird and it wouldn't kill the grandfather. Or maybe like you would fatally you would like wound your grandfather, but like he'd somehow survive. Or maybe like in a very far remote possible world, like your grandfather just like resurrects and then gives birth to you in that world even after you killed him. But it's like something consistent is going to play out. And I don't know. I don't find the linking premise particularly plausible, according to which if I could go back in time, then I could kill my grandfather in such a way that a contradiction or absurdity ensues. I just think no. Or at the very least, I'm not convinced of that premise. I think if I could go back in time, no. Even if I could, I couldn't then do something which is like absurd or contradictory or impossible. Something possible is going to play out. Okay, so I'm not convinced by that argument because it has a premise that I'm not convinced of. But nevertheless, I'm not generally a fan of circles of causation. I think causation is plausibly transitive. So if A causes B and B causes C, then A causes C, at least in some sense. And I think causation is irreflexive. So I don't think anything can cause itself. I mean, like, how could you cause yourself to exist? You have to like, you have to exist to have the causal power to like bring yourself about in the first place. But then you already exist, right? So it's like you kind of would have to already be there on the scene in order to somehow cause yourself to exist. So I think like self-causation just doesn't really make much sense to me. It seems to be incoherent. But if causation is transitive and irreflexive, that just like boom, that automatically rules out circles of causation because like circles of causation, when you have a circle of causation, that means X causes Y, which causes Z, which eventually gets you back to X. So by the transitivity of causation, it follows that X causes itself, right? Because X causes something, which causes something, which causes something, which causes itself. And given transitivity, you can collapse those down to one causal claim. So X causes itself, but that violates the irreflexivity of causation. So, and the transitivity and irreflexivity of causation, while transitivity is somewhat controversial and irreflexivity is not as controversial, they still both have a lot of support in philosophy. Like there's still both totally respectable views about the nature of causation, and I think they're both quite plausible. Now, I also think that explanation can't run in circles. I don't think a fact can partially explain itself, and I also don't think that like one fact can partially explain another fact, which goes back in turn somehow to partially explain the other one. I just think like that is a defective explanation because you're sort of presupposing the very thing in need of explanation somewhere in giving your explanatory account. So I don't like circular explanation, and that also is a very widely agreed upon view in philosophy. It's not universal. Almost nothing in philosophy is universally agreed upon. But I don't like circles of explanation. And I think that if you have a circle of causation, then you're probably going to land in some kind of circle of explanation. Because like if A causes B, then like A or facts about A are somehow at least partly explanatory of B or facts about B. And so then if you have like a causal loop, then you're also going to get an explanatory loop, which I think is impossible. Okay, so I agree with this premise. There can't be circles of causes.
So, in what sense? In the strongest sense, like it's logically impossible or metaphysically, I don't know.
Oh, I definitely wouldn't say logically impossible. But I would say my own view. People are free to disagree with me. It's a free country. But my own view is, yeah, metaphysically impossible. You can't have a causal loop. Because, I mean, otherwise you'd get a circular explanation, which is impossible. And otherwise you'd get something causing itself, which is impossible. Metaphysically impossible.
All right, let's proceed next. You wrote so many on this topic, so you have also debate with Professor Koons. So
He and I are on very, very good terms. We were actually just emailing the other day. So I love Rob, and yeah, Rob's great. Um, but yeah, this is like the core argument for causal finitism, right? That like it's the simplest thesis that resolves tons of different paradoxes. It's such a unifying account. It's such a good explanation for why all these paradoxes are impossible and why they can't arise. So yeah, this is like the Übermensch, like the ultimate argument for causal finitism. well, not with, in concert with presentations by Alexander Pruss and Josh
Sorry, can
Rasmussen.
you repeat? My internet was frozen. So
I just meant this is the ultimate case. This is the ultimate argument for causal finitism. It's like the master argument that it's like a uniform, unifying solution to so many different infinitary paradoxes. And for that reason, it's like an abductive argument. It's like the best explanation for why the paradoxes are impossible and why they couldn't arise. Now, if people are curious, I did have a discussion slash presentation with Alexander Pruss and Josh Rasmussen on my channel. That was at the Pacific APA last year on causal finitism, so they can check out that video that I had. And in there, I go into more detail why I am not a causal finitist. Okay, but what does causal finitism say? It says necessarily nothing has infinitely many causes. So infinite causal regresses are impossible, and also infinite causal cooperation. That's impossible. So you can't have infinitely many things all kind of as or training their causal powers on one target state or event or fact or entity. Okay, so that's what causal finitism says. Now, there are other solutions to various different infinitary paradoxes. So I'll lay out one infinitary paradox. It's called a Benedetti paradox. So imagine that, there's a victim named Fred. He's coming up. It's like 11:30 and we're coming up to noon. And there are infinitely many reapers, grim reapers, just these entities that can act super duper quickly. And they all have an activation time, and they really want to kill Fred. Okay. So you got infinitely many reapers, and here's how they work. Their activation times converge to noon from the later than direction. So what does that mean? That just means like one of them is set to activate and kill Fred at 1 p.m. One of them is set to activate and kill Fred at 12:30. One of them is set to activate and kill Fred at 12:15. One of them is set to activate and kill Fred at 7 minutes 30 seconds, and so on, just dividing in half all the times up to, but not including noon from the later than direction. So basically, there's just this infinite horde of reapers which are prepared to kill Fred. But there's no first reaper, right? Even though they sort of converge to noon. I mean, yeah. Okay. Now here's how their plan is to work. They're like, okay, listen, dude, I'm gonna kill Fred just in case none of the earlier reapers kill Fred. So like if Fred survives past all the other reapers, I'm gonna kill him at my activation time. But of course, if he doesn't survive that, I'm gonna do nothing. He's already dead. I can't kill a guy who's dead. Okay. Now, it just turns out that we can sort of like conclude that Fred is both dead and alive. Like we get a really crazy paradox here. I mean, we can get a contradiction from the stipulations that I just gave. Like Reaper number 1, which is set at, let's say, 1 p.m., he couldn't have killed him, right? Because like Fred would have had to survive infinitely many earlier Reapers, and Reaper number 2 would have seen Fred alive and just killed him, at 12:30 instead of 1 p.m. Okay, so Reaper number 1 didn't kill him. But the same thing is true of like Reaper number 2, right? Because like Reaper number 2 couldn't have killed him because there were infinitely many Reapers before Reaper number 2 who were set to kill him. And Reaper number 3 would have killed him if Fred had survived all the other ones and gotten to Reaper number 3, who was at like 12:15 or whatever, before Reaper number 2 at 12:30. Okay, so Reaper number 2 didn't kill him. And you see where I'm going. None of the Reapers could have killed him. Because that same reasoning applies to literally every single Reaper. Every single Reaper is such that there are infinitely many Reapers before him, one of which should have killed him. At least one of which. So none of the Reapers could have killed him. But we also know that some Reaper must have killed him, because if none of the Reapers killed him, well then in particular, none of the Reapers before the last Reaper killed him. And if none of the Reapers before the last Reaper killed him, remember, they kill him if and only if none of the previous Reapers killed him. So that means the last Reaper at 1 p.m. must have killed him. Okay, we just got a contradiction. None of the Reapers killed him, but also at least one of them killed him. Okay, that's a contradiction. The thought is like, hey, the Reapers, they're sort of sensitive to what the earlier Reapers do, so it's like an infinite causal chain of dependence. That's one thought. And so like causal finitism rules out this kind of case because it's an explanation for why it's impossible. Now, as it happens, I like an alternative solution to this paradox and other infinitary paradoxes. And the broad family of solutions, they're just what we can call deflationary solutions. So they don't adopt any like substantive metaphysical thesis in trying to solve the paradoxes. They typically just take the following form. Dude, you told an inconsistent story. You can't have all those conjuncts together. Even if each individual conjunct is okay, like even if you can have, infinitely many entities, even if that's individually possible, even if it's individually possible to have infinite causal chains, even if it's individually possible to have finitely many Reapers which have this intention and successfully implement it, like even if the various elements of the story are individually possible, Like we can't infer from that, and we shouldn't infer from that the whole conjunction is possible. And we shouldn't infer from the impossibility of the whole conjunction that any particular conjunct is impossible either. And like we also shouldn't accept any premise according to which, like, if the following substantive metaphysical thesis is false, then you could get this contradictory paradox. It's like, no, I reject that. I say even if the substantive metaphysical thesis is false, the paradox would remain impossible. It's not like its possibility would follow from the possibility of the falsity of the relevant metaphysical thesis. So like even if there could be infinite causal chains, I don't think there could be infinite causal chains which instantiate a particular structure which is paradoxical or contradictory. I mean, to me it just seems like an implausible premise. It seems like saying, well, hey, if there could be angels, well then there could be two angels, one of which thinks of another, each of which thinks of a number larger than the one that the other one is thinking of. Okay, that can't happen, right? But it's also not the case that follows from the possibility of angels. Like, this is a very bad argument against the possibility of angels. If I said premise one, there can't be angels like that. That's like a paradoxical arrangement of angels, where there are like two of them, each of whom thinks of a number larger than the other. That can't be. There can't be two numbers, each of which is larger than the other. So just because you can't have an inconsistent or paradoxical combination of angels and intentions, it doesn't follow that there can't be like angels or that there can't be like two angels. And likewise, I think just because you can't have a particular paradoxical or contradictory arrangement of infinitely many causally interacting reapers, it doesn't follow that you can't have infinitely many reapers. Okay. So I like deflationary solutions which don't adopt any metaphysically substantive solution or thesis. And those typically take the form of like, listen, like I said, you told an inconsistent story, but we shouldn't blame any particular conjunct for the impossibility. It's just the combination of them. Okay. Now, why do I like that? Well, I think deflationary solutions, first of all, and I think this should be uncontentious, that they're just like way simpler than causal finitism. So they don't have any substantive metaphysical commitments. Causal finitism, by contrast, like heavily restricts the range of possible causal structures. It puts considerable pressure on us to accept an implausible and like very profligate and wide-ranging spatiotemporal finitism, where like space and time are discrete, and where the past is finite, and where space is finite in extent, etc. It at least puts theoretical pressure to accept those things. Because like, hey, if time is continuous, say, like it seems like time is continuous. Seems like, maybe, I know Pruss has responses to this, but like if I drop this pencil and time is continuous, there are infinitely many moments, or infinitely many times, rather, instants between this pencil and its falling, right? And it seems like the state of the pencil at the end of that is like causally dependent on the states in between it, the infinitely many states, right? Like it causally depends on those together with the laws of nature. Like, so if time is continuous, for instance, it seems like there could be infinite causal chains. But of course, per causal finitism, you can't have infinite causal chains, so that pushes us to think you can't have continuous time. And like you can run somewhat similar arguments for other sorts of causal and spatiotemporal structures. So I think causal finitism puts very significant theoretical pressure to accept highly profligate, highly unsimple, highly controversial, highly contentious metaphysical theses that you're basically just going to have to swallow. And that's a big price by my lights. I also just don't think causal finitism offers a unifying solution to the relevant paradoxes. And that was supposed to be its most attractive feature, right? I say that because I think that there are just non-causal Benedetti paradoxes and other sorts of paradoxes as well that I think are non-causal. And causal finitism, of course, can't solve those because they don't involve any causation. And given that they're exactly parallel to the causal variance, I take that to be a serious problem for causal finitism. Because I think that the paradoxes should have clearly the same solution given their like basically identical structure. So just instead of supposing that like the reapers in question are like causally sensitive to what the previous reapers do, we can suppose that it's just a brute fact about them. Like in the story, it's a brute fact about them. They satisfy that biconditional. Like I kill Fred if and only if none of the previous Reapers kill Fred. That's just a brute fact. It's not like they check what the previous Reapers do. They just satisfy that condition brutally. Or maybe they're like non-causally explained by what the previous Reapers do somehow, instead of a brute fact. Now, of course, you could say, oh, there can't be that kind of non-causal dependence. Oh, there can't be brute facts. You can say that. But notice that we no longer have a unifying solution. You've now just like introduced inelegant conjuncts into your solution. Like you're like, okay, well, causal infinitism takes care of all these cases, but like, okay, we got to wield in some other crazy, not crazy, we got to wield in some other substantive metaphysical theses to solve these other paradoxes, which basically are identical to the original ones. It's like, what are you doing? Like, I think you're taking the wrong approach here. Um, I'm sorry, I'm not a causal. I'm not well. I'm not attracted to this argument for causal finitism. I also think that like modal epistemology supports deflationary solutions. So modal epistemology is just like, how do we know things about what's possible? Well, we have a lot of different tests that we apply. Now, they're not infallible, but like arguably they give us some reason to think that the relevant situations that satisfy them are possible. So I'll go through some of these modal tests that give us reason to think that certain situations are possible. But first, I'll talk about those situations. So consider world W1. This is a spatially finite Newtonian world, and there's an infinite series of massive particles, each half the mass as the one next to it, and half as spatially distant. So we got like a particle here. Maybe there's a particle a meter away, which is half as massive. And then there's a particle 1/4 of a meter away from that one, which is half as massive as that one. And then there's a particle 1/8 the way from that one, which is 1/2 the mass of the previous one, etc. So we got this infinite series of massive particles in a Newtonian world with universal gravitation. That seems to involve an infinite causal chain because it's given universal gravitation, infinitely many entities here are going to be causally impinging on, one of the entities in the series because it's universal gravitation, so they all kind of affect each other. I don't know. That seems possible to me. Seems totally conceivable. Okay, so that's when world W2 contains an infinite past in which two simple particles just revolve around one another for eternity. That seems to involve an infinite causal chain. And then world 3 is very similar to the actual world by stipulation. It has continuous time, and a 1-second process of me dropping a pencil takes place. And suppose that each instantaneous state of that process is causally related to the subsequent states, leading to an infinite causal chain. Okay, so we've got these 3 different worlds. We've got lots of different tests that are like independently motivated in modal epistemology for like motivating the possibility of a world or a situation, the metaphysical possibility of a world or situation. One of them is conceivability. I don't know. When I think about it, each of these worlds seems conceivable to me. Like I can like imaginatively flesh them out. I don't detect any contradiction or evident absurdity in them. We got modal intuition, so something just like seems intuitively possible. Well, I don't know. Each of these seems to me intuitively possible, or at least, at least I can get myself into that headspace. Modal uniformity. So like, I don't know, these worlds, or at least worlds relevantly like them, differ from the actual world, or at least some other possible world in merely quantitative respects. And Josh Rasmussen has defended this principle that if one world or one thing differs from another world or thing in merely quantitative respects, and the second thing is possible, then that gives us reason to think that the first thing or world is possible. There's a kind of like uniformity with respect to quantitative features, whether they're all possible or not. It's defeasible, so it's not like that's an infallible rule, but it's like Josh has good reasons for thinking that that's like a generally plausible rule, and it gives us some reason to think that the merely quantitatively different thing is indeed possible if it merely quantitatively differs from something which is also possible. There are various other reasons that I'm not going to go through for thinking that these worlds are like metaphysically possible worlds. Okay, and then the final thing that I'll mention here is a companions in guilt. Well, it depends on how you conceive of it. A companions in guilt argument against causal finitism. So I don't know. There are other causation-like dependence relations that can have infinitely many entities upon which one thing depends. I think that gives us reason to think that causal dependence can likewise have infinitely many basing entities or infinitely many entities upon which something causally depends. Just because I struggle to see a relevant difference between those non-causal dependence relations and causal dependence relations, which could explain why that's possible in one case but not the other. So I'm thinking here in particular of like grounding. So I don't know. It's like it's not very controversial that like infinitely many things can ground one thing. So like the set containing the natural numbers. Sets depend on their members. They depend on their elements. And so like the set, at the very least for their identity, like sets are defined by their members. It enters into their real definition. So like the set containing the natural numbers. Well, hey, there are infinitely many natural numbers and that set depends on all of them. It's like grounded in all of them. So look, that's a case of infinite dependence. Excuse me, yeah, like infinite grounding cooperation, where we have like infinitely many things grounding one target thing. And I think like even for theists, there's theoretical pressure to posit that sort of thing, given certain arguments about God's rationality, um, and given God's like omniscience and whatnot. But anyway, um, so I think that there's reason to think that there can be infinite non-causal explanatory cooperation. And I think that gives us reason to think that there can be infinite causal cooperation as well in violation of causal finitism. Because I don't really see any metaphysically relevant difference between those things, which could explain why one but not the other is possible. Um, okay, there are other problems that I have for causal finitism, but I have left those out for purposes of brevity.
Amazing. This is so extensive. So, is this connected with this topic? Because I had recently exams from a subject. It's called like discrete systems, and we look at signals like continuous, not discrete. So we analyze them and transform, and I don't know. So we say that signals in nature are continuous. So is it in any way relevant?
Yeah, so I mean, we're just going to reveal my ignorance here because I haven't taken a class like that. So I'm not quite sure what exactly that distinction is in that context with respect to signals in nature. But um, in math classes, there are distinctions between like, discrete systems and continuous systems. Yeah, those often do track what we're talking about here when we're talking about like discrete or continuous time, right? So like discrete time is where like they're okay, I'm going to simplify a little bit, I think. There are like shortest units of time, and there are only finitely many of those in any given temporal interval. Okay, so like maybe it's like the Planck interval, and there are just like a ton of those, but only ever finitely many within any interval, within any finite interval. By contrast, when time is continuous, um, there are continuum many instants of time within any finite period of time. So like, even from going from now to 1 second from now, continuum many instants of time just elapsed. Continuum many, that's the cardinality or size or number of the reals. So the real numbers. So that not only includes the natural numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. It not only includes um, the fractions, but it also includes like irrational numbers. So numbers that you can't represent fractionally. So like pi, for instance, or like radical 2 or square root of 2 and things like that. So like basically any number that you could have a decimal representation of, even an infinite decimal representation of, there are tons of those. And in fact, like there's a very large number of infinity of them. Okay, maybe it's not like a very large number of infinity. It's a large number of infinity of those numbers. And that's how many instants there are according to the continuous views of time between any 2 points in time. Um, I may not have explained that particularly well, but the point is just that there are infinitely many instants of time between any 2 instants of time under continuous views.
Amazing. Thank you, Joe. We are running out of time, so we need to hurry. So, next question. If
I'll
every
speed run.
contingent item has a cause, the first cause, does it need to be necessarily?
Yeah, so I mean, it would. So if we grant the argument, if we grant the old Kalam, excuse me, the new Kalam, and we conclude that there's an uncaused cause, then yes, we will get something, a necessary cause, if we add this additional premise that every contingent item has a cause. That's true. That'll follow. Now, okay, what's my personal view about every contingent item having a cause? Yeah, I think that's true. It seems intuitively plausible to me, and I haven't found any compelling defeaters for that intuition. But that's just like intellectual autobiography, so it's not very interesting. I think the real question is like, how dialectically effective are the arguments for this premise, right? Um, and then here we'll probably just recapitulate the dialectic surrounding the Kalam's causal principle, because I think like the arguments are very similar to the Kalam's causal principle for this principle. Um, and I think the dialectic would trace out very similarly.
Very good. Next, what about Occam's razor? Because if we have an uncaused cause, is it likely that it is one rather than many? So, also universal applicability of the laws of physics in the universe, does it point to one cause, or what do you think?
Yeah, good. So I think appeals to Occam's razor are a bit tricky. I think we discussed this in my book with Dan Linford on the chapter on Aquinas's first way. a similar kind of brief discussion comes up about Occam's razor, and they're just it's a little bit tricky here because like compare the following two scenarios. In one scenario, we take one or more things that we all already recognize in our ontology, like that we all already believe in, and then we just deem them theoretically uncaused. So like, we all already believe in like, let's say the physically fundamental quantum fields that the physicists posit, say, or whatever the physicists posit as the physically ultimate part of reality. Like we all already recognize those. Everyone's already committed to those. Um, and like one thing we could do is we could just say like, oh, like the uncaused cause is like one of those or something. Something that we all already recognize in our ontology. That's one thing you could do. But a different thing you could do is you could posit something like totally new and radically unlike everything else in our ontology as the uncaused cause, and just say that there's like one of those. And it's honestly like hard to tell which one of these is simpler. I think it'll probably depend on complicated debates about like intrinsic probability, because I ultimately think that simplicity only matters insofar as it affects the probability of a theory. So it'll just really matter what one's theoretical posits are here and how like coincidental seeming are the features of the uncaused reality or realities that you're positing. And that'll just be like a very complicated assessment. Like we just have to see the proposals here and compare them, right? Like compare the theories. So I actually wouldn't agree that like as a as like a general rule, no matter what, like positing one uncaused cause is automatically going to be simpler. Like it'll depend on the features of the hypotheses in question. And like also it'll depend on whether or not, well, I'll just leave it at that. We're gonna, get into significant debates. Now as for the universal applicability of, oh, and by the way, like I can go like 5 minutes over. That's fine. So like to 2:35. As for universal applicability of the laws of physics, I don't know. I think it's just like it's reasonably intrinsically probable. So probable even antecedently to examining any evidence that the laws of nature would be uniformly or universally applicable. Um, like compare the following two hypotheses. Like the law of gravitation applies everywhere versus the law of gravitation applies everywhere except for this some tiny patch in the Andromeda galaxy. Like that second hypothesis is like really arbitrary. It posits a disuniformity. Like the very fact that the laws of nature hold everywhere else apart from that patch gives us reason to think that it also applies in that patch, just given standard inductive reasoning. So like that hypothesis has a deep kind of internal tension within it, and also it's got like a deep arbitrariness, like an ad hoc restriction on something which would otherwise be very simply statable, and which would otherwise be very elegant and compactly describable. So like I think and all that gives us reason to think that like that's a very intrinsically unlikely way for reality to be. Um and so I just think like given plausible constraints on like intrinsic probability, it's just going to be reasonably intrinsically likely that the laws of physics would be uniform like no matter what. So I don't know, it's not clear to me that there's pressure towards positing a single first cause from the uniformity of the laws of nature. Because even if there were many first causes, I don't know, I just think it would still be decently likely that the basic laws of physics would be universally applicable. Um, yeah.
Very good. Okay, so what else can you tell about Anka's cause? Jacob Erasmus tells that he should be maybe creative, maybe good, intelligent, supernatural, so have enormous power. So can you comment each of those? So,
Yes, I mean this is a good question. Now, one thing I do want to note here is that the new Kalam does not actually get us to a cause of the whole cosmos, right? Like it gets us to for each causal chain that there is in reality, that causal chain traces back to an uncaused cause. But that's very different from saying like there is some uncaused cause which stands at the base of all the chains of causation within the cosmos. That would be a sort of subtle quantifier shift that we don't want to commit. That would be a sort of fallacy. Um, so the new column doesn't technically get us to a cause of the whole universe. That's one thing that I want to note. But like, let's suppose we got to a cause of the whole universe. If we did, um, if we got to the cause of the whole universe by means of the Kalam or some other Kalam-like argument, I do really like the idea of combining the first stage of cosmological style arguments with teleological style arguments. Like, I am generally speaking not a big fan of like the ordinary stage two reasoning, the reasoning that tries to just like unpack conceptually what the first cause must be like on the basis of like the theoretical role it serves in the argument in the Kalam, and then trying to show that that's like that's God. Um, I generally think that those arguments are not dialectically effective. Um, like they're not persuasive. Um, but one approach that I actually would recommend to people is to like, you know, stop taking that more conceptual analysis approach and combine the first stage of cosmological style arguments with these teleological style arguments, like looking at, yeah, the complexity and the orderliness of the effect and psychophysical harmony and like nomological harmony and fine tuning and various other things. Um, and, this has been, or like this was partly responsible, just noticing this connection between first stage of certain cosmological arguments to which I'm sympathetic. Um, I'm unsympathetic to many cosmological arguments, but like there are certain cosmological arguments to which I have sympathies, and noticing that I could combine those with teleological style arguments was partly responsible for increasing my sympathy toward theism. So um, this is actually I'm glad we're sort of ending on this because I think that this is where I would encourage people to go next is to try to like combine the arguments, start focusing on more cumulative case style stuff, and stop trying to think that like the Kalam itself would be able to get you to God, because there are many challenges to that.
Okay, last we have, I think, 1 minute. So things operate in three ways, basically necessity, randomness, or free will. So would you say it's most plausible that it's by free will? Can you comment briefly? Sorry.
No, no, it's all good. Yeah, I'll be brief. I just briefly, I think this will depend on whether you are convinced by the teleological style arguments or other arguments. I think that just on the basis of the Kalam, you're not going to be able to plausibly answer this question. I think you're going to have to bring in teleological style considerations or other considerations. So that's my briefest response. And then as for your last question on whether the new Kalam is compatible with A theory, B theory of time, the good news is that it's compatible with both. So that's good. It's a good making feature of the argument that it does not take a stand on that. So yeah.
Okay, last word for people. Any message before we close?
Well, thank you for this conversation. I hope it was very helpful and edifying to people, and I hope it gave them lots of tools to sharpen their thinking about the Kalam and about the fundamental nature of reality. And of course, they should immediately subscribe to you firstly, but also they should go to Majesty of Reason and subscribe to me and turn on the bell for notifications. And of course, like lather me with the money on Patreon, right? Like, I'm a grifter. We're all grifters, so like you gotta feed my grift, okay?
Yeah, but only if they have time to subscribe to your channel. Firstly, they need to subscribe to mine. So sorry.
Yes, everyone, you need to literally go down right now, click subscribe, and turn on the bell for Nemanja's channel.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, goodbye. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.